Hello, this is Eric Martin, Professor of History at Lewis Clark State College, and welcome to my kitchen table. My wife and child have gone off on a mini vacation over the weekend, and I just can't bring myself to go downstairs into my basement office while I got the whole house to myself. So here we are. Today, I want to talk with you a little bit in terms of setting up our next discussion, which is over Chapter 5 in Worlds of History on gender, sex, and love in classical societies, focusing on India, focusing on China, focusing on the Mediterranean world. Now, I don't have a whole lot to say about the sources in particular. I just want to give you some ideas about what you might say about the sources in particular in our discussion boards. Now, our discussion boards, I've already posted some questions to get us going, so that's fine. But I thought it might be useful if I reviewed a little bit about what we've been doing at the conceptual level in this course, because this week we take an additional step in that. So what we've been doing at the conceptual level in this course is we have been developing a skill set to work with data. We've been working on organizing data, identifying data, distinguishing data, interpreting data, placing data into some sort of context, and trying to do something with the data. And in our particular case, the data that we're using, the name of the game, is world history. But I think that the skill sets that we're working on in terms of how you utilize and work with data will be applicable to you. Pick your major, pick your career field. You'll probably be working with data in some way, shape, or form, and so you're going to get mileage out of these abilities if we work on them. And so what I want to do is I want to give a quick review of where we've got, what we've done so far, and then we'll do a little bit more in terms of where we're going. So far at the conceptual level in terms of processing data, what we've worked with first was identifying the way that data is organized. And one way we did that was periodization schemes, historical stages, right? Those are the way that historians organize time. They're not real, but they're useful for helping us to place similar types of data together. And now we can work with it a little bit. Historians like to shuffle the deck. Some historians like to use different periodization schemes. But we have these concepts that we use to help us understand the data that we get. The other thing that we've been working on is distinguishing between primary source data and secondary source data. And that's important. Those are the two major forms of data that historians work with, and you should have figured that out by now. We've been working on it the whole semester. Also, then we take the next step. Well, now that you can distinguish between primary source data and secondary source data, let's work on understanding how secondary source data can help shed light on the primary sources, how they interact with each other, how in order to get a better grasp of what a primary source might be telling you, that utilizing that secondary source to read into the primary source, right? And that's why, and I hope you figured this out by now, that's why almost all the chapters that we've dealt with so far, they're organized more or less along the same lines, right? 1 or 2 secondary sources, 6, 7, 8 primary sources, and they're all interrelated to one another. Now, the other source that I hope you're using is that Traditions and Encounters textbook, or whatever type of world history textbook that you chose to pick up instead of it because of the price. That textbook also helps to provide context. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to look at the role of women in the Mediterranean world and ancient Rome, for example. Might be very useful to read the section in that book about ancient Rome and get an idea about what's going on. So we're using our different sources, our different data sets to figure things out, right? Okay, then we went into comparing data sets. And that's what we worked with last week as we were comparing the two ends of the Silk Road, comparing how the Romans chose to engage in statecraft and how the Han Chinese chose to engage in statecraft. So we're taking, here's our secondary source data set and our primary sources on the Romans. Here's our secondary source data set and our primary sources on the Han Chinese. And now we're going to engage in kind of melding these data sets together and see what we come up with. All right. This week, we are going to continue the process. So we're going to use all these skills, but now I got a few different questions to ask you. The first question is this: what's the difference between studying a historical moment and studying a historical process? Now think about that for a minute. The difference between studying a historical moment and studying a historical process. You could probably get out a piece of paper if you wanted to and come up with a short list of the pros and cons to each approach. Here are the pros of studying a historical moment. Historical moment, brief picture in time. Pros, you get a lot of depth, you get a lot of focus, you get a lot of understanding on how this one thing operates. Cons, you might not really understand why it took place or how it took place if you keep your lens too small, right? Historical process, big lens, deep time. Looking at a historical process, you get the big picture, right? But if it's too big, you might not get to see detail. And so one of the examples I like to use is to describe history as a lot like photography. All right? And that as historians, we need to have different kinds of lenses in our camera bags. Telephoto lenses, wide-angle lenses, lenses with different kind of filters on them, because each of those lenses takes a different kind of picture. One picture is not better than another. One picture might be better than another for a particular purpose. But one picture is not inherently better than another. We need all kinds, and when you interpret data, you need to be able to move back and forth through the lens, right? Well, the camera bag, the lens metaphor, maybe is complicated by this historical process thing. Because it got me thinking the other day, it's like, well, maybe historical moment is like being a still photographer. And historical process is like having a video camera. And the advantages and disadvantages between being able to examine one thing for a long period of time versus trying to watch something in motion. You guys can play with the metaphors, right? But that is something we're doing, distinguishing between a historical moment and a historical process. Are there different techniques, different things you should keep in mind as you study things from each one? So what I would like for you to think about as you read the material on gender, sex, and love in classical societies, are you looking at a moment or are you looking at a process? In fact, the better question is probably, at what points are you looking at a moment? And at what points are you looking at a process? Because it's frequently going to be both. And I think just to be able to identify that for conceptual purposes is important. Don't drive yourself crazy over it. But think about it. The other thing that I want you to do with this week's readings, particularly with the primary sources, is I want us to introduce 3 new questions that you need to think about whenever you read a primary source, because they are so important. And it's important not just for historical stuff, but for contemporary things. Pay attention to who the author is. Who wrote this piece? Not just their name, who were they? I teach a course in political philosophy at LCSC. I encourage you to take it. And I really attempt to drive that home in that course. It's like you cannot understand the document if you don't understand who wrote it. So think about that. Get into the habit of looking up the author. Find out who they were. The other thing that I want you to think about in terms of the each document is, who did they write it for? Because that's also important. Is this a government document created for a bureaucratic archive? Or is it created for the emperor himself? Or is it created as a letter between a husband and wife? You guys can continue with the what ifs, right? But I think that who the document is written for and why that document was written is important. On the Ban Shao piece that we're going to look at, the lessons from women, pay careful attention to that. Who she wrote it for is easy. But if you read the document carefully, you'll see why she wrote it might be a little more subtle. And then finally, and maybe this is kind of what I was leading up to, the agenda. Why did they write the document? Why did they write the document? What was the purpose? What was their intended purpose? Attempting to persuade someone, attempting to inform someone. And keep in mind, the documents, sometimes they're really straightforward, right? Code of Hammurabi. I wrote the document because this is the law. All right, fine. But other times, maybe the agenda is not so clear. So, author, audience, agenda. Y'all keep that in mind in the primary sources. Y'all talk about that in your discussion posts with the primary sources, and then we'll be able to bump this whole discussion up a level. That's all I got. As usual, if you need to talk with me, email me, call me at the office, drop by and see me at the office. If none of that works, let's make a mutually convenient appointment to Skype or Google Hangout or whatever we need to do to make sure you're learning what you need to learn in the class. And having said that, enjoy your historical studies, and I'll see you next time.